Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of the Student Spotlight. My name is Oliver, and with us today is a recent student from the Future Scholars Program at CCIR. Her name is Katie Doran. Katie is currently a senior at Menlo-Atherton High School in the Bay Area. She took the course with Dr. Victoria Fendel from the Faculty of Classics from Oxford on rhetoric and politics. And today she'll be joining us to talk a little bit about her experience at CCIR, sort of the outlines of her project, what the contents of her research was, and as well as what her relationship with Dr. Fendel looked like. So to begin, Katie, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Katie, if you don't mind, actually, just could you just briefly introduce yourself and maybe give us a quick overview of how you came to choose rhetoric and politics as one of your first choices for the Future Scholar Program, and what sort of interested you initially about this course?
Yeah, so like you said, I'm a senior in high school from the Bay Area in California. And right now, one of my major interests has always been related to politics and history. I'm looking to study political science in college next semester and next year as my intended major. And so rhetoric and politics was one of the courses that stood out to me from the start. Like I said, I've always been pretty interested in history, and rhetoric and politics seems to do a good job of connecting history along with some of my other interests in politics and English, and being able to look at the effects of language throughout history. As I was searching for summer programs, this one particularly caught my eye because I was looking for something where I could take initiative and go into and pursue something of my own interest and direct my own research while still having some sort of mentor that I could rely on. And rhetoric and politics just seemed to fit into the subjects I was interested in.
Excellent. So if you don't mind, tell me a little bit about how Victoria had set up that particular course. So you mentioned that this is a course that weaves together various aspects of, so Dr. Fendel is a faculty of classics, so her interests are going to be very historical, very at times quite literary, driven by things like interests in sociolinguistics as well as politics and so on. So with such a interdisciplinary area of study, tell me a little bit about sort of how the actual course proceeded, how these different threads of history, literary criticism, philosophy, and politics, and so on sort of came together in the actual course itself.
Yeah, so for the first half of our course, we focused on lessons and lectures from Dr. Fendel. And being faculty of the classics, she definitely had a greater interest in the classics and ancient Greece and Rome than I would generally consider myself to have. The research topic that I eventually ended up choosing was much more modern. It was from the 1900s about the women's suffrage movement. And so there definitely was that contrast there, but I really enjoyed being able to look at something different and consider rhetoric and politics from a time period that I haven't really studied so much. So that was where we started. We did progress throughout the centuries as the weeks went on, but that was where we started, and it was super interesting to see all of her expertise there and also the interest of some of my classmates. I remember I had one classmate whose final research project ended up being about the connection between some of those ancient thinkers with Enlightenment philosophy. And it was just really interesting to see how all the different time periods and all our different niches within history came together, but still came back to the idea of rhetoric and politics. So for the first few weeks, we focused on those lessons and lectures. And then the second half, it was more on the research and guiding us through our independent projects.
Mm-hmm. And since you brought that up, let's talk a little bit about that. So as you mentioned, the first half of the course is really this sort of broad survey of the interactions between rhetoric and politics from antiquity to today. If I vaguely remember the contents of that course, I think it begins with things like Aristotle and so on, and then proceeds all the way up to people like MLK Jr. and so on. And so with such a broad survey with so many different angles, how did you begin thinking about what you would be interested in to do with your own project?
Yeah, so I think I started by thinking about what I knew I've been interested in studying in the past. I knew even going in and even while we were looking at ancient Greece and Rome, that probably wasn't the time period I was going to choose from, nor the region I was going to choose from. I've always been someone more interested in US history, and particularly history as it pertains to politics and civil rights, as well as women's history. And so women's suffrage was something that I was thinking about as one of the possible angles I could go into with my research project from the beginning. And as we went through the course, I sort of refined it more. My topic definitely shifted a bit over time until I settled on what I ended up researching.
Yeah, and I think it's useful at this point maybe to actually say what it is that you ended up doing. So I have the title of your paper right here, but it'd be great if you can just share that with us and then unpack a little bit what that title is gesturing at, and then go into a little bit about what that actual paper explores.
Yeah, so the title of my research paper was called, quote, "This is Our War with Banners Instead of Guns, the Impact of World War I on the National Women's Party's Suffrage Rhetoric." And so the first part of that title comes from a quote. It's "This is Our War with Banners Instead of Guns." I believe that was Alice Paul. And it references, I think, a big part of what became the center of my research paper, which was the impact of World War I on the National Women's Party and its rhetoric and strategies. So the National Women's Party was considered to be one of the more radical or militant branches of the women's suffrage movement. And in particular, they definitely capitalized on the national zeitgeist at the time, with so much of the United States being focused on World War I, and also the values of democracy and constitutional rights that came with this focus on a war that was said to be fought for democracy. And so the focus of my research was how the National Women's Party was able to take advantage of all the focus on the war and all the rhetoric around the war and sort of co-opt that same language into their advocacy for women's rights and for expanding democracy rights to women.
Okay, interesting. So I see how that reflects in the sort of quote that you picked. Is there any sort of concrete example that you can point to that shows the way in which, as you were sort of progressing with your research, that really struck you as a sort of perfect example of the way in which the women's movement sort of took up the rhetoric of, you might think of as partially war propaganda, as well as sort of the pro-democracy elements of that rhetoric. So were there any sort of specific instances where that rhetoric was particularly interesting or inspired?
Yeah, gosh, there's a good number that I could reference. I guess I would start by breaking that down into 3 separate categories, if you don't mind. There were 3 main strategies that I focused on in my research. The first being that, like I sort of talked about before, that focus on democracy and civil rights and the Constitution, as well as pointing out the hypocrisy of the US. And I think one of the instances that really points to that is this quote from President Wilson at the time. He said, while referencing World War I, "We shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to the authority to have a voice in their own government." And so that quote originally comes from Wilson while he's addressing, while he was at a conference addressing Congress, but those words were also written on picket signs as members of the National Women's Party picketed outside of the White House. They were brought up in conferences with President Wilson while they were negotiating with him. They appeared in copies of the National Women's Party's weekly magazine. So it was sort of this idea of taking the same words the government was using at the time and then turning them against the government and saying, this is the promise that you've made to your citizens, and you're failing to fulfill that when it comes to women's rights right now. And so that was the first perspective. The second perspective was also that there were a lot of comparisons to women's suffrage progress in other nations involved in the war, from allies to enemies, from Britain to Germany. And they were all aimed to portray the US as being behind the times, because we always extolled ourselves as being the global leader in democracy, and yet we're falling short of more, quote, conservative allies, and even falling short of some of our enemies in terms of that progress. And then the last main strategy I focused on was the use of war-related imagery and metaphors and terminology, essentially. The National Women's Party would call suffragists an army. They said that they were battling in the first trenches of a war, the first trenches being the White House. And there was a lot of effort to sort of equate the movement to the war so that they could capitalize on all that positive sentiment that the United States held towards veterans and soldiers at the time, and say that these women were also performing an honorable act for the country and for expanding democracy as well.
That's super interesting. I want to follow that up with what might be a slightly difficult question, and that's to ask, part of, I imagine, the interest in sort of looking at the history of the rhetoric of the women's movement in the United States could just be a pure historical interest in sort of what was going on at the time and what kinds of things they drew on. But I imagine part of it is always also going to be motivated by a continued interest in possibilities of rhetoric and certain sort of political projects in the present day. And so this is a pretty generic question about the ways in which the study of history might inform our present day politics. In that respect, as you were doing your project, as you sort of learned more about the different rhetorical strategies that women were in the US were employing in the early 20th century for these sort of broadly feminist causes, how has that shaped, if at all, your understanding of current political possibilities?
Yeah, so I guess taking that question of why studying this kind of history and strategies is important. Well, first, it's because I find it very interesting and I like to nerd out on it. But even aside from that, I guess there are two main ways that I sort of see this connecting to the present day or having a lot of significance as a topic of study now. The first being that it's a lesson in how to capitalize on the zeitgeist of the time, how to capitalize on public perception and public preoccupations. These suffragists were very, very successful at taking advantage of what the public was thinking about, what was at the forefront of their mind, and using that for a somewhat separate cause. And I think that's, a strategy that's going to be present and important to any successful civil rights movement or advocacy movement throughout history. There's always a need to think about what people's values are at the time and think about how to appeal to that. But secondly, I think, and this is from a more historical angle, but still a very important one in my opinion, is that there's this tendency when we think about women's suffrage, I think sometimes there's a tendency to almost dismiss some of the efforts of suffragists, particularly suffragists involved in the National Women's Party, who were seen as being too radical or too militant, and to dismiss their successes by saying something like, well, in World War I, women became more involved in the economy and they became more involved in the workplace. And it was because of that that public perception shifted to give women more respect. And as a result, suffrage was just the natural result of that, and that it wasn't necessarily the result of all these specific strategies and these very calculated strategies of suffragists, but almost just historical accident or coincidence or serendipity from the convenience of the political situation at the time. And I think that papers and research like what I was doing aim to bring attention to the fact that these successes did not just come because World War I happened to make people realize women deserve respect. They came because suffragists forced the public to realize that. It was not just because women were more involved in the workplace, but because suffragists were actively pointing that out and were pointing to other important reasons that they saw that women deserved suffrage right away. And many of those same reasons were things that Wilson cited in his final speech when he finally did endorse women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment. And so part of why I think it's important to study this is that it reframes that historical narrative to center the actual efforts of activists and to show how the actions of activists and the strategic decisions of activists led to their successes, and that it wasn't just the result of the historical context of the war, but specifically how they took advantage of that.
Yeah, and I would say that that's definitely a narrative you hear quite a lot, which would be, I guess, broadly speaking, a more sort of reductionist, materialist version of how that particular tract of progress came to be. And it is definitely interesting and valuable work to sort of highlight the role that human agents played in changing the situation rather than simply imagining change to be sort of a natural, as you said, a natural process. Okay, that's really, really quite interesting. I want to shift gears a little bit from talking about sort of the actual substance of your research and what you got out of it to sort of more of the aspect of your relationship with your mentor and how Dr. Fendel, through your, well, not just Dr. Fendel, we should probably also mention your TA, whose name is?
Dr. Fendel. She did both parts for our group, actually.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, you probably interacted a lot more with Dr. Fendel than some of even the other students. So I would be curious to learn as you started developing your idea, as you mentioned this process of sort of whittling down your topic as the weeks went by and shifting things, how did that happen? How did that occur through sort of interactions with your mentor?
Yeah, so when I originally proposed my research topic, I had a much broader scope. I wanted to focus more on the evolution of women's suffrage, or not women's suffrage, but just feminist rhetoric more largely, from the time of advocating for women's suffrage to the peak of advocacy for the Equal Rights Amendment, which is a pretty big time period. And I also didn't have a specific group or person that I wanted to focus on the way that I eventually started focusing on the National Women's Party specifically. And so I definitely started with a wider scope, and Dr. Fendel let me do that. She encouraged me to consider all parts of that topic, but also did warn me from the beginning that it was a large scope and that it would be difficult to cover all of that, especially in a research project where we had pretty limited time. And I really appreciated that she encouraged me to explore all parts of my topic while still giving me that warning, because she ended up being quite right. And I did end up narrowing the scope of my topic once I decided which parts of it were most interesting to me, as well as which parts were going to be most feasible to research. It was just really helpful to be able to have a professor there who would guide us really through every step of the process, who would talk to us about how to write an abstract, and then who would read our rough draft abstracts, which were kind of bad, and help us refine them with patience and expertise the way that Dr. Fendel did. And I had a lot of fun working with her, not only because of all her expertise and how knowledgeable she was, but also because she genuinely encouraged us to be excited about our own topics. Everyone in our group had a totally different time period and a totally different topic that they were focusing on. And it was really interesting to see how all these different interests came into play and still ultimately connected to that idea of rhetoric and politics. And Dr. Fendel encouraged us not just to go into researching the classics like she probably would have done, but to pursue our own interests and to think about the things that like we most wanted to study. And I think that made everyone a lot more excited to be in class and to be creating our projects.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. And I guess in relation to some of these aspects, so earlier I talked about how the actual substance of your research might have affected your understanding of sort of political activism in the present day. But maybe we can think also a little bit, or talk also a little bit here about the process of doing research and how that's informed your understanding of maybe where you are, and you're a current high school senior about to go to university. Has this experience in any way shaped your understanding of what you might want to do, or changed certain understandings of what you thought you wanted to do?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that this has necessarily changed my plans, because I knew going in I was interested in history and politics just as I am now. And I had done a couple other research projects that I really enjoyed, and I knew research was something I was excited about. So while it was definitely a meaningful experience, I wouldn't necessarily say it changed what I plan on studying or my future plans. But I do think with each research project you do, it really gives you more perspective on the amount of effort that goes behind something as simple as even like a 10-page paper or a 20-page paper. And let alone like a textbook that you might be reading in school, or like a lab report or a study that's hundreds of pages long. Because like the paper I wrote ultimately ended up being a little over 20 pages. And I think like the amount of effort that goes behind each page, the amount of effort that goes into finding each source, and then deciding that maybe you don't want that source, the amount of sources that never make it into your list of references because you read them and spent time on them, but then decided they weren't ultimately relevant. There's just a lot of unseen work that goes into the creation of the literature base in any subject that you want to study. And I think research projects like that, like this, really give you perspective for that. One anecdote is just that I found an archive of 300 magazines called The Suffragist, which was the weekly magazine of the National Women's Party for a few years. And I went through quite literally hundreds of magazines. I ultimately ended up citing maybe 20 of them or so that ended up being most relevant to my research. But it's the fact that there were so many there and that were largely uncategorized and unorganized on this online archive. And it was a process that that I actually kind of liked because I really enjoyed looking through these magazines. I thought they were really interesting, but it was also a whole lot of work, and it gives you a lot of perspective for how many different sources and how much how like the corpus that you have to consolidate to create something, even when you're only citing a little more than like, even when you're only citing like 20 or so of those magazines, the amount of effort that goes through sorting through each of them, and the amount of effort that goes through constructing any research project of any kind.
Yeah, I'm not a historian, thank God. My own field is actually philosophy, and I look at historians who do archival research, and I think, wow, I really hope I never have to do that. It does seem, but it's that sort of patient, painstaking labor that ultimately is incredibly respectable and valuable. I want to ask just a little bit about this archival work that you did. Have you done archival work before, and sort of what is your favorite part of doing archival work?
So I hadn't really done that exact kind of archival work before, I guess. I have done research projects that have consolidated a whole bunch of sources, but typically I'm grabbing small sources or one or two documents from each different source and not focusing so heavily on one corpus. I think that the reason why this particular magazine became so important to me was because this research topic was really focused on one group of women who also happened to have a weekly magazine that formed a really perfect example of their rhetoric. So it was kind of natural that it became such a big part of my research. And I definitely haven't done it on that scale before, sorting through something like 300 magazines. I guess my favorite part of it would have to be when you're sorting through these magazines, it does get a little bit monotonous. You're like clicking page after page, and each page is buffering and loading on your computer. And it does take a long time, but there's definitely a certain kind of excitement that comes from finding that quote that you know is going to be so good for that part of your paper, or that you know is going to be so good for your thesis. And so even if it takes like 5 or 6 magazines, or even like 10 magazines that you sort through before you even find one quote, being able to have that moment of like almost discovery each time, and being able to immediately start thinking, this is so cool, how am I going to implement it and add it into my project? How am I going to integrate that? I think there's a moment of curiosity and joy that only comes because you've put in so much effort to find that one quote, that it just makes it really exciting to find it, because you know you've put a lot of effort into it, and you know it's going to work well in your paper.
Yeah, and I can't remember who. I won't say the quote if I can't remember who I'm quoting it from. Okay, well, in that case, I want to end I think we're sort of coming to a pretty natural endpoint for this episode, and I would like to end on a question that I always end these interviews on, which is for students who are sort of interested in, but maybe daunted by, or who are considering but unsure of whether to do sort of a in-depth research project like the one that you've pursued, especially in light of all things that you've said about its tediousness, its difficulty, and so on. What would you say would be what would you say to a student like that considering something like this?
I mean, I would say go for it. But I would also say, pick a topic that you love and that you know you're going to enjoy researching. Don't try to force yourself to research something just because you think like someone else is going to find it interesting, or it's important in a particular like scholarly community right now. Focus on finding something that you know is going to be exciting to you, because your project is really going to be what you make it. I don't think anyone in my group would have been able to produce the level of work that they did had they been assigned a topic, or had they been handed a topic by Dr. Fendel. It was because we were each passionate about our own phase of history and our own movement in history that everyone's projects came together. And I think the biggest piece of advice I can offer is to let yourself be excited and to choose that topic that is going to make you excited. Because even though it's tedious, it doesn't feel tedious and unrewarding if it's something that you know you're passionate about and that you're really excited about creating a project on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have one tiny comment about that. Way down the road, if ever you decide to enter into academia, one of the scariest things that you'll see is people selling out for academia. which is really a puzzling phenomenon because everyone who comes into academia does it because they love it. But then because of any complex bureaucratic system with all sorts of weird stakeholders and so on, you end up having to sort of modify your interests so that you fit in with the mainstream discussions and so on. But one of the great difficulties of that is academia is maybe one of the least profitable places where you could sell out to. So if you're going to sell out somewhere where you can make a little bit more money, I think. But so ultimately, academia is definitely going to be driven by being actually interested and passionate about what you do. And it's really, truly lovely to hear that there's something of this ethos being instilled with you guys, with Dr. Fendel. So with that, I want to just say, Katie, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really, really interesting. There's actually way more that we could have talked about that we didn't touch on, but this is our time. And thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you.